we have no real media in this state. Well, you have us.
It's really time for a parent revolution.
Never let a good crisis go to waste. That's what the left did with COVID in so many different ways.
Wind energy, especially offshore wind, is a big loser and just another government boondoggle.
Like, what's going on?
People are fed up. They lied to us then. They're lying to us now. They're assaulting our families.
What we do is we look at the lies of the left that they keep pushing out, that America doesn't work for black people. That is not true.
They want to now monopolize truth and say, truth is only what we say truth is. Damn the data, damn the science.
The key with science is it always needs to serve objective thinking. They just call anyone who challenges them a science deniers.
They're evil.
Shut up or we'll cancel you.
What we're going through is a cultural revolution.
This is big, and this is how change begins.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Ocean State Current Command Bunker. Now playing from In The Dugout, number 37, Mike Stenhouse.
Hey folks, today we explore the false narratives about offshore wind farms. And we have two special guests coming up to talk with you about that. More on them in a second. You know, in short, Rhode Island's net zero strategy and our Act on Climate legislation, they've put Rhode Island on an unsustainable, unreliable, and unaffordable path towards a costly and very, very dangerous energy future. And we're going to explain why, one part of that today. Hey, welcome to In The Dugout. Your host, Mike Stenhouse here. The Act on Climate, Rhode Island's net zero energy policy, is fraught with omitted, misrepresented, and arguably false data, false expectations, fake news regarding the capacity for green energy to reliably and affordably and abundantly replace fossil fuels that we've come to rely on, fossil fuels that have improved our lives in so many ways, fossil fuels whose climate impact is getting lesser and lesser every day as technology and clean technology increases. But yet Rhode Island is stuck on a path to decrease fossil fuel sourced energy and increase it with alternative green energy. Today, you know, but it's impossible to make that case in the normal legislative process. But there's an opportunity that has arisen this summer and that we hope to be able to tap into in the coming months. The Rhode Island Senate passed a legislation creating a special commission, a Senate commission comprised of 5 senators, 4 Democrats, 1 Republican, who will evaluate where Rhode Island is as far as meeting its Act on Climate and net zero milestones and other initiatives. This is a very small setting. Apparently, they met for the first time last week just to set up some procedural, you know, elect a chairman, how often are we going to meet, you know, how are we going to conduct the meeting. So we expect that in the future, we're going to be able to provide testimony and information that might ask that committee, as it's chartered to do, to make recommendations, try to slow things down a little bit in the state. We're on an unsustainable path, and our zeal to provide, you know, this is the irony here, and our zeal to provide for a sustainable future, as they say, they've created an unsustainable path, and we've got to slow it down. Green energy, alternative sources of energy are just not ready for prime time, especially when you consider the changes at the federal landscape, Supreme Court rulings, federal court rulings, the Trump administration versus the Biden administration, and most importantly, with the advent of artificial intelligence, which we all know is going to put a massive future demand on energy. We need to be able to meet that future demand in a reliable and affordable way, and in a way, of course, that doesn't harm the environment. But like I said earlier, the United States leads the world in reducing carbon emissions, not because we're using less fossil fuels, but because we're developing newer and newer technologies that reduce carbon emissions. And as we've had with guests before, some level of carbon emissions we need. Increased carbon emissions in a small way is actually good for the planet, as our prior guests have said. But at this commission, we're going to have a chance to put forth new evidence, evidence that was ignored, evidence that was overlooked. We're going to try to conduct or ask them to conduct some kind of meaningful cost-benefit analysis that was not conducted. These lawmakers were negligent in putting us on this net zero act on climate path without conducting a requisite cost-benefit analysis. It was not done. They didn't want to hear it. It was all agenda-driven politics. It wasn't evidence, science-based. It wasn't based on any of that. So we're going to try to bring some of that into the mix. We're not asking them to abandon the Act on Climate right now. We're just saying slow it down. And for the reasons my guests are going to give to you in just a minute, there's every reason in the world to slow it down. The process was corrupt. The data they either ignored or twisted, that was corrupt. The expectations set were corrupt, and they're moving the goalposts on that. You're going to hear that from both our guests today. So it should be the purpose of this Senate commission, which is going to give a lot of advocates a chance in a more intimate setting to probably more thoroughly than they ever could do in some kind of official legislative committee hearing. But this commission should be a little more relaxed, and hopefully we have a better opportunity to put information out in front of the Senate, this Senate commission, so they can make appropriate recommendations. We hope to try to slow down this race. Rhode Island was so proud to be first to set net zero standards of any state in America, and we know now that's a suicide path. So I want to welcome our first guest. He's a member of Green Oceans. We've had the Green Oceans president, Lisa, on this show in the past. Our guest, Martin Kits van Heyningen, is a member, a senior member of Green Oceans. He's got a great background in technology, in the environment. And like I said, he's also the founding member of the Energy Council of Rhode Island, often referred to as Tech Rhode Island. And then we're going to talk to Alan Brooks. Alan is a longtime energy guest on this show. He's an energy expert. He's a senior fellow at the National Energy Institute. And more on him in just a second. He'll be the second half of the show. So sit back. We've got a really in-depth, deep dive look into the one component of the whole green energy plan. Again, a plan that is unsustainable, and that's looking at just what I'm going to call the scam of offshore wind farms and why they're not what they've been made out to be. So without further ado, let's meet our first guest. Okay, so joining me now is the aforementioned Martin Kits van Heyningen. That's quite a mouthful for an Italian guy like me. Martin, welcome to In the Dugout. You're a rookie, but I see you're playing ball with us and you got your cap on already.
Yeah, my Colorado Rockies hat on. I was trying to think of what I should wear. I was either going to wear the Harvard hat because, I know you recently got selected for the Hall of Fame. Congratulations on that for College Hall.
But wait a minute, you're a Yale guy.
But that's why I couldn't wear it. So I wanted to, I just couldn't do it. No, I thought Colorado Rockies would be apropos for our discussion today because they were a once great team. They made it to the World Series, played our Red Sox in 2007, and now they're just epically bad. They're like the worst team in baseball, and that's kind of where Rhode Island is headed if we don't turn things around here and get our energy situation figured out. So, and focus on what Rhode Island's famous for, which is beautiful scenery and beaches and fishing, so tourism, all that kind of stuff.
That's a brilliant analogy, and I've used a different analogy in describing Rhode Island. With our beauty and our natural, our history, and of course our beautiful landscapes on land and on the oceans. I've always said, Rhode Island is like the greatest laptop in the world. It's beautiful, it's sleek, we just have lousy software running it. Sure. So I don't know. That's just been the analogy I've used. Okay. You are a member of the Green Oceans Executive Committee. We've had another one of your executives on, Lisa, in the past. And you're a founding member of something called the Tech RI, which is the Energy Council of Rhode Island. Just very quickly, tell us about Tech RI and just a very quick intro about
Sure.
Green Oceans.
Sure. The Green Oceans is really focused on, the environmental issues. So it's a grassroots group that's completely funded by the members, don't take any external money from any organizations. Although anytime you say something about offshore wind, they'll scream, "Oh, you work for the fossil fuel companies," but not true. And it's really an environmental group that's focused on, all of the impacts of offshore wind. The technology, the Energy Council of Rhode Island is more focused on the technical side. Like, what is offshore wind, due to grid reliability, the intermittency, how these degrade every year due to, parts wearing out, like we've seen in Block Island. So it's kind of an interesting, dichotomy. You focus on both the environmental issues and the cost issues, as well as really the science and engineering behind, grid reliability and maintaining, cheap power for everyday people.
All right, so thank you for that. And last month your Green Oceans group, let me bring it up here, put out a report, and then shortly after that there was a media release. But canceling offshore wind leases was the name of the report. We're going to get into some details, but just generally tell us about how that report came together and what its top level findings were.
Sure. Let me just back up one sec for your listeners.
Sure.
To put it in context. So what we're talking about here is offshore wind off the coast of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. It's 9 different wind farms have been approved have been given leases, and it's for 1,000 turbines covering 1 million acres of ocean. So each one of these is 870 feet tall, so it's taller than any building in Boston. These things are absolutely gigantic. And it's going to be the largest marine construction project in the history of the world. And it's going to cover an area larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. So, and they're all highly concentrated in this space with 1 nautical mile spacing. So it's just a continuous sea of turbines. And what happened is that each one of those was divvied up into small, small companies, effectively LLCs. And they said, okay, here's Block Island. It's only 5 turbines. That doesn't sound so bad. They got their environmental approval. Then they did South Fork, and that was 12. Then Revolution Wind is 67, and Cape Wind is 140, and Sunrise is 100. So they never did a continuous study of the entire environmental impact of 1,000 of these. And each one of these turbines is interconnected, so they're jet plowing in between every single turbine, connecting to, there's 3 offshore power stations just for Revolution Wind, where they convert the power to high voltage DC and then transmit it. Then they jet plow up Narragansett Bay to go to Quonset, and they're about to do the same thing in the Secana River for another wind farm called South Coast.
Right.
So there's a lot of environmental issues concerned with that. And what this report does is it really looks at, how were these leases approved? Like, how could this be? Because when you read the environmental impact statements, they outline all of these ill effects. Like, they talk about major adverse impact to commercial fishing. So it's a little bit like a lawsuit where both sides agree on the facts. So you just ask for summary judgment. But in this case, it just got approved. So despite the fact that...
All right, so let me jump in here, because I don't understand this, and probably if I don't understand it, some of my viewers might not either. When you talk about a contract, who's the contract between?
So the contract is between a private company, and this for Revolution Wind, it's Ørsted, which is a Danish oil and natural gas company that changed their name to Ørsted because it's much more, because Dong, I guess, wasn't a great name for the U.S. But in any case, it's all of these companies are oil companies that have branched off into selling electricity, because you can charge a lot more for offshore wind than you can for natural gas. So the point is that these companies were given leases, and those leases have certain obligations. So back in 2005, the
So it's the offshore wind companies with the government?
yes, the government is the one who does like the studies and the approvals, and that's now under the Department of the Interior. And there's a group there called BOEM, which is the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. And they're the ones that's responsible for making sure that everything is done correctly and all the environmental impact studies are done, complying with the Endangered Species Act and, NEPA and all these various, obligations. So what this report does is looks at, systematically, how were these approved and did they make any mistakes and did they misrepresent? And what the group that did this report called Planet A Strategies found is that there's significant misrepresentation, there's errors, and the fact that it explicitly causes harm and interference to commercial fishing, navigation, and defense and the environment. So, in that law in 2005, when they amended the Outer Continental Shelf Act, they said, okay, you are allowed to have offshore wind, and we may grant a lease. But the Department of Interior shall ensure that there is no interference with, and then they enumerated commercial fishing, navigation, environment, defense, et cetera, and all these other things. So it was
Life, right,
mandated.
right. Yep. Okay.
And then during the Biden administration, they said, hey, we're going to get 30 gigawatts of power. And it was just basically, pedal to the metal. We're going to approve these things. So they had a problem because what the law said isn't what they were allowed to do. So they wrote an internal memo or regulation that said, what we're going to do? We're going to balance those things. We're going to decide, how much harm we can do to fishing and how much defense, radar interference we're going to allow, and we're going to somehow balance these things, which is not what the law said. So that's a major finding in this report.
All right. I want to get back to some of the specific findings, but I want to keep it at a high level. And I meant to say this right off the bat. When you say Green Oceans is an environmental group, used to be environmentalists, whatever, climate change, global warming, we're all on the same side. But
right,
in my view, the prescriptions to combat global warming, if you would, climate change, now, with these big windmills, whether it's solar farms on land or windmills on land or windmills offshore and others, they now seem to be threatening the environment, as you said, and there appears to be, now you're not all necessarily on the same page. Would you agree at a higher level that the climate change movement and the environmental movement are now not always in sync?
I couldn't agree more because, in the old days, if you said, hey, I'm going to plant 1 million tons of steel in the middle of the best fishing grounds, in the East Coast, you would have been lynched, right? You would have said, like, that's insane. But that's what we're doing. It's the equivalent of 1 million cars being dumped onto, Cox's Ledge. And Cox's Ledge, the environmentalists used to agree that we had to preserve that. It's like a national treasure. It's like a rainforest. So in 2012, Senator Reid and Senator Whitehouse, had a press release saying, hey, good news, we've excluded Cox's Ledge from the wind lease area. It's great news for fishermen and we're saving the environment. Then 10 years later, we really got to get more offshore wind. So they put it right on top of Cox's Ledge. Why is that? Because it's shallower there and it's cheaper.
So just to follow up on that, so have Senator Reid and White House changed their tune, or are they just now silent about it?
Well, I think the issue is that environmentalists morphed from caring about the environment to becoming, radical advocates for anti-global
For an
warming
agenda.
and climate
For an
change.
agenda, yeah.
So no matter what facts you put in front of them, they go, yeah, but climate change.
All right.
So it's like they no longer are able to balance things because in the old days, it was a trade-off, right? Like, oh, we're going to build a road. Oh, that's good. But, oh, we're going to go cut down some trees. Oh, that's bad. We have to take a reasonable approach here. But once the environmentalists got this climate change agenda in their head, there is no longer any ability to reason with them. It's just, it seems to be that they're blinded by this, and they don't care, they're ruining fishing spots. They don't care they're dumping 150,000 tons of rock debris, and jet plowing. And think about, Rhode Island used to be famous for jewelry and,
Right.
all these heavy metals in that used to get dumped into the Narragansett Bay in the old days. Well, now you're just jet plowing through that, stirring all that stuff up, And as you said, in the old days, that would be environmentalists would
Right.
be going crazy, big oil companies doing this, Now it's the big oil companies doing it, but they changed their name and everyone's fine with it.
All right, let's set the stage for a report and for your media release that I want to spend some time now discussing with you, Martin. So, at the federal level, we've got a new administration. It's no longer the Biden administration who's going to ignore the data, ignore the environmental harm findings or fears, and just automatically rubber stamp everything according to agenda. You've now got an administration who's a little skeptical of that. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum is now conducting a review of all wind leasing and offshore and other permitting practices. In this regard, we're talking about on the oceans, on the outer continental shelf. What can you tell us about the change in attitude at the federal level, first of all, with regard to the Department of the Interior?
Right. So Doug Burgum's, a very rational, smart, dedicated, leader for the Department of the Interior. So I think we're very lucky to have him. The executive order that Trump signed back in January called for that review that you're talking about. So we commissioned this report, that was the lead author is Maureen Coates. She's also an attorney. So specifically to address, and give to the Department of Interior, which we've submitted so that this will help them in their review, because we've been doing a lot of research on this over the last 3 years. So I think this report kind of codifies all the issues here and gives them a lot of ammunition to go in and look at what was actually done and why.
So I think let's go through some of the specifics. Your report basically looks at whether or not there's been adverse economic impact to fisheries, to the environment, even national security. I want to get into that. Ecological, we all see what's going on with whales and other sea life washing up on shore. Want to get into that. So let's start with fisheries. What's your report and what's your position on that?
Right. So because in any kind of energy siting, you still have to do it responsibly. In other words, just because, solar panels, are going to save, reduce CO2, that doesn't mean you should clear cut the Amazon rainforest and plaster it with solar panels, right? So the problem for commercial fishermen is the location that was selected here. Save the Bay called it the worst possible location for an offshore wind farm. So it's like, and right off the coast of Newport and Middletown, I think if you paid somebody $1 million and said, okay, find the worst place on earth that you could put one of these wind farms, they're like, got it, off the coast of Newport. This is a great spot. So for commercial fishing, and it's not just at the federal level. I mean, the CRMC, which is the Rhode Island Coastal Resources Management Council, had a fishermen's advisory board. And because they had the opportunity to stop this, they had the opportunity to opine on this plan. And all 9 members of the Fishermen's Advisory Board resigned in protest because they said they don't care. They're not listening to us. All they're doing is exactly what these foreign.
It was all for show, right? They had them on there so they could say, "Oh, look, the fishermen are on our side with us," and they said, "Hey, you're not going to use us anymore," right?
Right. Yeah. So it's very clear that this is going to create a lot of economic harm for them. And the frustrating thing is, and it was outlined in this report, is that they admit that, right? So they admit that, and then, but what they've come up with is to say, well, we're going to mitigate it. So we're going to give them money, right? So now BOEM is handing out money or negotiating money for fishermen, as compensation for harms that they're not allowed to inflict. So not only are they, inflicting harms, they're admitting they inflicted harms, and then they're paying for to compensate, not very well for harms that they're not allowed to inflict. So the whole thing is just kind of crazy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the fishermen might get paid. I mean, it still doesn't help with their livelihood, but nothing about the cod and the other, the southern New England cod and other fish habitats that are being
Right.
destroyed. I mean, it's just crazy. I mean, it doesn't compensate for that, does it?
No.
Okay.
No, and it's not enough for the fishermen to retire. I mean, it's just a pittance. So,
All right, let's stay ecologically for a minute. Do
okay.
you believe, I mean, oh, those whales washing up on shores in Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New Jersey and Maryland and all up and down, oh, it has nothing to do with the offshore wind farms. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I agree with people who say, it hasn't been proven, but it also hasn't been studied. In other words, you're not allowed to take an endangered species like a right whale and subject it to the kind of 200 decibel noise that they're doing, because that you'd be arrested because
Right.
they're the protected species. So you are not allowed to do the study. But what's clear is that there's a very high correlation, in other words, with seismic surveys. So another argument is, well, it's climate change. That's what's killing the whales. Well, climate change doesn't travel, up and down the East Coast only when there are seismic surveys happening. So because of that, you can rule out things that are common across, the region. So climate change is a common variable. Ship strikes is, well, must be more ship traffic. You can look at there's no more ship traffic in these regions, as it goes along. So there's a very high correlation, and the sound measurements, like people like Rob Rand, who are an acoustic expert, they've taken measurements, and they've actually shown that there's this noise profile is immense. It's like 200 decibels. So what is likely that is happening is that this noise is frightening the mammals. It's maybe causing them hearing damage. And when they're frightened and they can't hear well, they run into ships and they get hit by ships. So it's just, that's a theory. Can we prove it? No. But it follows the pattern of whale deaths follows as they move from section to section and begin the seismic surveys, which these are like booms. It's like an explosion, so they can measure 200 feet
Yep.
under the seabed. It's not like a fish finder looking for fish. These are so loud that they go 100 feet below the surface of the ocean, so they can figure out where to put the pylons.
So you can clearly demonstrate correlation.
That's right.
As you said, proving causation, is going to require further study, but the correlation seems pretty strong.
Yeah. Because it correlates with miles of surveys done. So if you look at in a region, how many miles have we done, it correlates to whale deaths. So it's like whale deaths per mile of survey. So it is just a correlation. But as I said, the tests that would be required are illegal, and you'd have to intentionally harm a whale, which nobody wants to do.
All right, I'm going to go back to something you had mentioned earlier. You talked about data being ignored, being misrepresented, being omitted in various studies or in various statements of approval put forth by the people and partners in the contract. I mean, I would put this all under fake news, just to use a headline that's provocative. That this whole offshore wind farm is not based on actual evidence. It's based on false narratives that improperly put forth or omit data or flat out ignore it.
Right.
Would you agree with me on that?
That's right. And they try to convince the public by saying, oh, it's, the wind is free, so you can lower your energy bills, when in fact, it's the most expensive form of energy on Earth. It's 4 times the cost of natural gas delivered electricity. The other false narrative is that they say, oh, we're going to power, 1 million homes. The correct answer is you're not going to power any homes, because there's no homeowner anywhere in New England who wants to have no electricity for 7 hours a day. So on average, you could power a home, but nobody wants average power. They want power all the time. So, and that's the problem with wind. It's variable
That's
on,
such a good point. That's such a great point. Yeah.
and it's variable in all time scales, minutes, seconds, months, days, years. Like Germany's just gone through 2 years with very low wind output. So they're burning a lot of coal. So
Right.
there's no, the weather is variable. And the
In
funny
other
thing,
words, it's unreliable.
it's unreliable. And the funny thing is that they say, well, climate change, the weather's going to be, weather's getting unpredictable and extreme and it's all bad. So we should get our energy from the weather derived sources. Which is,
In your release, you brought up something, or in your report, I can't remember where I saw it, that I never ever considered before. You kind of mentioned it before, I think, when you were talking about radar or sonar or something, but you think these windmills have an adverse national security
right.
implication. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So this is now well documented in the UK where they've already built it out. They've now allocated $1 billion for the Defense Department in the UK to try and figure out a way to mitigate this. So if you just go out in your Boston Whaler and turn your radar on and go out, you'll see the problem immediately. It's just you have this incredible clutter, which for navigation is an issue. But with GPS and you can navigate your way through them. The problem for radar is if you look at the early warning radar systems that are in Cape Cod, these are phased array radar systems that look low over the horizon to detect incoming strategic missiles. So there's an impact to that, and if currently the Department of Defense has about half a dozen studies that they're trying to figure out, if there's any way to mitigate that. So that's another example, that was pointed out in this report is you're not allowed to interfere with defense, period. It's not like you can say, oh, well, maybe we can mitigate it. That's not what the law says. It says you're not allowed to do these things. So, it's another example of a really good, solid reason why these leases were granted, in our opinion, illegally, and they need to be withdrawn.
So let me just stay on this a second. So not only are we ignoring ecological impact studies and sea life studies and efficiency studies and cost studies, because we know the costs of the electricity to consumers, but they're also ignoring the potential threats to national security to detect potential enemy submarines or
Right.
surface boats or even aircraft coming in because it's going to interfere with the effectiveness of radar and I assume presumably sonar as well. I mean,
Right.
and
Yeah.
you're saying that this is well documented?
Well documented. Sweden's had this problem. They've been trying to mitigate it. The UK, US, we've done radar. There's been a report. I don't recall who did it, but it's a very detailed study. It's part of the documentation package for Revolution Wind, where they look at the radar interference. They look at interference with weather radar. So, you might have noticed that on weather radar now, as you go offshore, it seems like, you see a cell moving along and then it kind of disappears. So you don't have the same ability to see, storm cells approaching. So, but these are, again, the frustrating thing is that all of this is out there. All of this is known. It's in these, packages, and then they just did it anyway.
Wow. All right. I want to ask you, what comes next stuff, but is there anything else in your report that you'd like to mention that we didn't already discuss?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's in the report and that I've talked about in the past is that ISO New England did a study because, as Rhode Island wants to be net zero by 2050, and what would that actually take? And where I disagree with this report, Maureen Katz's report is that ISO New England says we can just overbuild. So we'll just build 94 gigawatts of wind, and then we'll make up for the lack of reliability and the intermittency. But that is impossible. A, because it would cost, trillions of dollars, but B, because these offshore wind farms are in the same region. So weather patterns tend to be regional, and dark and cloudy and low wind periods are regionally affecting. So if you have a group of windmills outputting zero, adding another 1,000 windmills that also output zero will not fix your problem, because the weather is more regional, and these outages will be across the grid. And that's, becomes grid destabilizing,
Yeah, we did a whole report on we coined the term freezing in the dark. I mean, on the
Right.
coldest of winter nights, and you go to flip on your heat or flip on your electricity when everyone's trying to do the same thing, it might not be there under this increasingly, alternative energy scenario
Right.
that
Because
Rhode
at
Island
night,
is on the path. I mean, this is we're not just fear. This is a legitimate concern, right? I'm going to just use freezing in the dark to exemplify grid failure, but that's not pie in the sky fear mongering, is it?
no, because what happens in the coldest days are windless days, because that's when you get the
Right.
radiational cooling. So on the very coldest of cold, record cold days, there's almost no wind, because that's how you get super cold in New England. And then if you have a storm like a blizzard or a nor'easter, the windmills shut down because they have a cutoff velocity of about 20 meters per second. So it's a narrow range. So if the wind's below 8 or 9 miles per hour, they can't start. And if it's above, 40, 45 miles an hour, they'll self-destruct. So it's not at all
Wow.
exaggerating to say that this is going to be a problem. And if you think that can't happen to an area the size of New England, look at what just happened to Spain and Portugal. So, and that's the other part of, one thing is intermittency, you just don't have electricity. The other thing is grid reliability. And grid
Right.
reliability depends on inertia. So we're used to getting 60 hertz power when we plug something in. Well, that 60 hertz is exactly 60 hertz because you have a gas turbine spinning at 3,600 RPM. That's 60 times a second. So windmills and solar panels don't have that. So they have to create that frequency, but they don't have what's called inertia, which means that if there's any disturbance, they can get out of sync. And if the grid gets out of sync, it collapses. And that's what happened in Spain. The entire country collapsed.
Wow.
And this was like
Wow.
3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago.
Yeah,
So,
something similar, I think, in Pennsylvania too, with the lawn stuff. All right, I want it last segment, Martin. All right, so we documented all the problem, many of the problems. Our next guest is going to get into some of the performance issues of these windmills that are already up. But what is the call to action? What is it your group is looking to do, and how are you looking to get it done? What is the realistic scenario that or vision that your group has for Rhode Island and our offshore wind component of our Act on Climate
right.
legislation?
So we're really doing a couple things. We're supporting the education, which we can do. But what the most effective thing for us at this point is through our litigation efforts, asking the government to reevaluate these approvals. We have two lawsuits against the government related to Revolution Wind and South Fork, and another one related to New England Wind. So, and that requires money. So, I think the most effective thing would be, donations, a small group of people. It's, no one's getting paid. 100% is going towards this work. So greenoceans.org. And there's also a ton of information there and presentations, and, all this stuff is just super well documented, because this is, the people who are running this, are absolutely meticulous in putting forward these facts.
All right, so correct me if I'm wrong. So I see two paths here. One path is what you just mentioned, working locally. So would it be the General Assembly? Is it the governor? Is it DEM? Would it be the General Assembly that would have to cancel the contracts or modify the contracts? I mean, who is the key decision maker you're trying to lobby, if you would?
Well, the key decision makers, unfortunately, now are all in Washington, because we've,
All right, so it's really a federal issue, you
it's a
think?
federal issue. But you bring
Okay,
up a
all
good
right.
point, is that these power purchase agreements are what is where the money comes from.
Right.
That's been approved by the Rhode Island, public utilities. And, if you could think about it, that a public utility is intended to serve the people of the state, right? So to
Yeah,
get affordable, reliable power, that's their job. Their job is not to be crusaders for the environment or some cause. That's somebody else's job. There are a lot of people whose job it is. But the, utility commission is their job is to provide cheap, reliable power for Rhode Island. So Rhode Island Energy, the president of Rhode Island Energy was just on a Q&A a couple of days ago and said, because everybody's mad at Rhode Island Energy because their electric
right.
they're going
Rates are
through the
so
roof.
high, right?
And he's like, offshore wind is the most expensive kind of energy there
Yeah.
is. And
My hands are tied.
Island,
Talk to the lawmakers, right?
they're the ones who are saying, well, we have to do this, and if you look at your electric bill, it's not just the cost of electricity, it's the distribution charge. And the distribution charge is where they stick all the costs for the grid improvements and the,
Yep.
green energy subsidies, so that even if you want to switch providers, you can't. So so I think Rhode Island Energy is not the one to blame here. I think, you know, and
It's the
Revolution Wind
lawmakers, yeah.
they've kept missing their deadlines, and I actually looked at the contract. They've given them 3 extensions, and that's it. So if they miss the next deadline, Rhode Island Energy has the legal right to walk away from the contract. So, and that would probably require some support from, the Rhode Island legislature, but
And I think they're pretty much see these windmills as a religious experience, and so I agree. If what you're saying, I don't think the Rhode Island legislature is going to change their tune very much. So I think you're saying is we're going to have to rely on Doug Burgum and the federal government to do something to.
Exactly. So we've got two main paths here. One is the one you just mentioned through Burgum and the Department of the Interior and the Department of Energy and maybe even the Department of Defense. But the other one is through litigation, where we've got federal. It's right now it's scheduled for a summary judgment on September 2nd. So we're in the final stretches. Has been year and a half or 2 years. So we're pushing to get that to closure and see if we can prevail in court, because the facts are all on our side.
I might want to do a separate interview with you or someone else, one of your attorneys. Are you guys a interested party or plaintiff in that case?
Green Oceans is, yes.
Yeah, I'd like to talk more about your lawsuit. I think we talked to Lisa about it a long time ago, but I'd like to get an update on that, and I'll contact you or Lisa in the future. Martin Kits van Heyningen, thank you so much for informing me and more importantly, our viewers of the true news, not the fake news, the true news about offshore wind farms and why they're not living up to expectations and why those expectations are probably false in the first place. Martin, thank you very much. Thanks for playing ball. Let's hope the Rockies do better. Let's hope Rhode Island does better, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. All right, and let's now meet our next guest. So we welcome back to In the Dugout our good friend, energy expert, Alan Brooks. We'll get into the post he wrote, but Alan, again, remind our viewers of you have a Substack account, you're an energy expert. Remind them of your important affiliations when it comes to energy.
Okay, well, you're right. I do write a Substack, Energy Musings, at substack.com, and that's where they can read it. It's usually at least one article a week, oftentimes two. But I'm also a senior fellow with the National Center for Energy Analytics, which is an energy policy focused organization. And, I write papers and research reports for them. And I also write some columns for energy publications, magazines and online publications.
And you didn't even realize it, but you write for us. Well, not really. We took you took your Substack from July 7th, and which I thought was a brilliantly written piece, and we just recreated it word for word on our Ocean State Current for our fans. And that's what I want to discuss with you today. Our first guest, I know you didn't hear the interview with Martin Kits van Heyningen. We talked about all the procedural, ecological, even national security problems with with offshore wind farms. But your column, which people can read the whole thing on oceanstatecurrent.com, your column points to the, I would say, underperformance, right, of windmills. We do have a few up and running. There has been some data collected. So just before we get into any ideas at a high level, what is it we are learning about the delivery as compared with expectations of these windmills?
Well, I think the bottom line is that every wind farm has a different performance, and that drives the economics of the projects. It's the reason why the industry has pushed for larger and larger windmills. The whole idea being that the bigger they are, the more power that they can generate, the more consistency they will have because they're higher up in the air. Of course, that creates negative implications also. But I've started back really when following this whole industry when Cape Wind in the early 2000s was trying to get going in Nantucket Sound and ultimately got killed. But that led Block Island's wind project by Deepwater Wind, to be the first performing offshore wind farm. So I have tracked the data for that, and I have found it very interesting. I'll make this point now. What was claimed at the time by Deepwater Wind and GE, who was the supplier of the turbine, to be the performance standard is no longer accepted by the current owner, Ørsted, and by the media here in Rhode Island, who is complicit in basically saying, oh, the lower performance is fine because it's what,
Wait a minute. Hold on, wait a minute. I want to understand this. You understand what you're saying? I don't, because I'm not as smart as you
Okay.
are. Are you saying they're shifting the goalposts?
They did shift the goalposts. When Ørsted,
So we were told when these were funded and approved, we were told to expect level up here, and now we're being told to expect a level far lower. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. The press releases that came out from GE and from Deepwater Wind, and I have a snapshot of the website that Deepwater Wind used to have, and it claimed that the wind farm would produce 125,000 megawatt hours a year of power. And when you run that through the capacity factor, it says you essentially a 47, almost 48%, performance is what was expected. Now the goalpost is 42%. And what that did when Ørsted took over was it made some of the historical data look like the wind farm was outperforming. There's a picture, a graph in my report that shows you year by year what the performance has been.
All right, we'll get to that. Wow.
Yeah.
So with my first guest, we had a general theme that these contracts, these proposals, these offshore wind farms were based on either false data, purposely misinterpreted data, or data that was conveniently omitted from any discussion or evaluations. And now you're saying that on top of all that, they're trying to pretend that these wind farms are living up to expectations when they're not.
Not to the original expectations, right, which was the claims made by Deepwater Wind and their supplier, which was part of the selling point for backing the Block Island Wind project. Now, there's also, admittedly, the viable option at the wind power was going to be cheaper than the diesel fuel power on Block Island, which turned out to be true. But the point was that was only part of it. And that's why they were able to get a 30-cent, essentially power
per kilowatt hour, right?
Yeah. And why the PUC rejected the original contract because they looked at the cost benefit analysis, and that enraged the Rhode Island legislature, and they rewrote the PUC rules and said you cannot use cost benefit analysis when you look at offshore wind projects.
Wait a minute. You cannot conduct a fair or accurate or reasonable cost benefit analysis, just blindly accept our wishes.
That's exactly what the rules are now. And if you read the opinion of the PUC when they approved the contract that was resubmitted for approval, they basically said, we can't test it the way we would normally test it. So, therefore we have no reason to reject the contract.
So my point being, forgetting the underperformance for just 5 seconds, what would have been what was an initial horrible cost versus benefit analysis for ratepayers and the public, and it is called the Public Utility Commission, not the Special Agenda Utility Commission. But what was a horrible cost benefit analysis then, when expectations and the goalposts were up here, any cost benefit analysis done now would be far worse because they've lowered the expected output.
The performance, yes, would suggest that the valuation would be worse. Yes.
And we're just being asked to ignore all that.
Yes, you're paying for it. If you're a utility customer in Rhode Island, you're paying for it.
Anybody who opens their electric bill knows they're paying for it. All right, so that's the general setup. All right, so we've got here your report, your charts. Where would you like me to go? You're familiar. Where would you like me? Any text you'd like me to highlight? Any charts you want me to show? You want to start with this chart right here?
That's the chart that I was talking about. What you can look at is the performance annually in terms of the total number of megawatt hours produced by the turbine, the wind turbines off Black Island.
All right, so explain this to me. What's that red line?
The dotted red line is labeled theoretical capacity factor, which you see is 47.6%.
And that's what we were promised.
That's based on 125,000 megawatt hours a year. Okay. What you see is the best year was, I think, 2020, when we hit like 122,000 or something like that. I think it's in the text there. When they reached 45.7%, it's theoretical. They were still below the 47, so they didn't reach what they were advertising and promoting, which was part of the reason why they wanted people to back offshore wind project. Okay.
So now, the goal is to reach this dotted line, right? That was what we were promised. That was what we told was going to happen, right?
That was the original target. Yes. That was the original selling point.
And in no year did they reach it. 1 year, maybe 2 or 3 years they came close. But look how far below we are here.
Oh yes. Well, that's one of the points I make in there, because what you see is the first 4 years, 17, 18, 19, 20, reasonably good. Then in 21, there was the repairs, the mandatory and, repairs that took the turbines down for an extended period of time. So it did pretty poorly. Then it came back somewhat in 2022. But now you have the records of 2023 and 2024 that are in the 30%, which is even 10% below the revised or lowered threshold.
So does this show that even when maintenance is done, which is expensive, that windmills deteriorate in their efficiency over time? Is that what this is showing, or is the weather patterns changing?
That is definitely something that we know about the historic performance of wind turbines, onshore and offshore. They do lose efficiency over time. the blade edges wear. That's the plastic that falls in the ocean or falls on the ground. I mean, they require constant maintenance. What my point was there is, Orsted really has never commented on the poor performance of the last 2 years. What's the?
If after 4 years windmills begin to deteriorate physically and in their performance, and we're spending these what tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to erect them, that's a horrible return on investment.
Yes, it is. And that's one of the problems. You don't see a lot of wind farms, especially offshore ones, going beyond their theoretical life, which is 15, 18, 20 years. Although in many cases there are 20-year, 25-year contracts to provide the power, and they will struggle to meet those, but they're being taken down or repowered, which under the incentives or subsidy programs, and not just in the US, but in other countries around the world that have offshore wind, that's a way that the developer can get more money, is to repower, the wind farm.
All right. So not only were we misled on how much output, I don't think it was ever discussed that declining output after just 3 or 4 years. And it was also probably not discussed, I'm guessing, because in your report, and let me bring it back up here, you talk about unscheduled repairs in 2021. This is not part of the calculation. Hey, we're going to have to conduct these major and expensive repairs every 3 or 4 or 5 years. That was not part of it. So when you say unscheduled, that's a pretty significant word in development right here, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And they've never, nobody's ever told the world what the problems were. But those windmills were down for extended periods of time. You can talk to the fishermen who were out there and they were watching them, basically just sitting there, not spinning at all. They had, boats out there and people on the cranes and everything else trying to fix them. So we don't know the full extent of what the issues were. Was it a manufacturing defect? In which case, the owner would have a claim potentially against the supplier, which was GE. Or is it just wear and tear? Is New England water and air, a tougher environment? Yeah. Well, there are a lot of questions that, you only learn over time with studying the historic record. And that's why I've been curious, and I follow, the monthly data that gets reported to the government, federal government, and you can download it, and look at it. And then you look at the monthly performance, which is also an important consideration. And if you remember, one of the strengths of offshore wind is that it's stronger in the winter. Now, that's a plus in New England because New England suffers from a lack of gas supply. So when natural gas is rationed in effect because home heating demand picks up in the winter, so the electric utilities cannot use natural gas to generate electricity, and they import, LNG from abroad, which is very expensive, or they rely on bringing back coal plants, oil plants, whatever, to fill that void during the winter. So the economics, of your power bill changes during the winter time, and it's why the utility, the fuel cost component of the Rhode Island energy bill, goes up for the 6 months of winter and down during the 6 months of summer.
So what are we looking at with this chart, other than we see the higher output in the winter months?
Basically every year's output. And as you see, it's the first few months of the year, it's generally high, the same as the last few months of the year, which is the winter time. And as I say, that's was one of the arguments for putting out offshore wind is it's stronger in the winter, which is when New England has a problem with natural gas supply. Now, the summertime, the demand goes down, the wind tends to blow less strong, and we get a lot more lulls, etc. Now, if air conditioning becomes a bigger, demand, as it is, say, in the South or the Southwest or whatever, what you see is then the need for that power increases. But that's not true in New England at this point because air conditioning is not as universal in New England. So you can accept low performance from the offshore wind during the summer because you don't need it as much. And I use need in quotations from that point of view. But the winter time is the toughest one for the electric utility grid.
All right, but is that paradigm going to shift a little bit? I mean, if we try to electrify cars, I mean, most people drive more in the spring and summer than they do in the winter.
Yeah.
Is that going to shift electric demand more to the summer when wind farms produce less?
Yes, there's no question. If we electrify everything, you will have higher demand in the winter because you'll have electricity powering, home heating. But when you have more electric vehicles and you electrify all industrial processes, etc., yes, you're going to shift the whole demand curve upwards.
And these wind farms just can't possibly match that. That's the bottom line.
That will be an additional challenge to it.
All right. Now this black line here, dotted line, shows the start of 2025. That we're this is almost like the worst year so far, right?
Yeah, the first 4 months of the year you'll see is almost the worst of any of them. Now I think it's the May data or April data is that high one. That's getting back to looking pretty good, but that's 1 month out of 4.
All right, so I'm sure you'll be updating this, and we'll have you back on. All right, so this is all Block Island wind. That's how many turbines?
That's five
turbines. How many offshore wind projects are there in the Northeast right now?
There are, I think, 3 being built at the moment, and then.
But how many are in operation where we can collect data?
In operation, there are only 3 wind farms in operation, and that's what I track in that report.
Yeah. No, we only put the Rhode Island data here.
Right. Yeah.
But are you finding the same problems, the lower output from original expectations and the same other issues with the other wind farms already in operation, or is Rhode Island an exception to the rule?
Okay. The second wind farm was the test project down off Virginia, and that one is performing exceedingly well, but that's 2 wind turbines at the moment.
Just 2?
While they're building their huge thing. I'll come back to that in a second because there's an aspect of that that's important. The other one that I started tracking is South Fork Wind, which started operations in last fall.
Where is that?
That's off the tip of Long Island. And that's 12 turbines, and it's power's going into Long Island. We don't know what the standard is that they expected. I haven't been able to find any expectation, of what the performance is. And you will see a very different, performance, but we really only have a few months to know, and it's performing basically stronger in the winter and less in the summer. But we don't have enough of a record to know much about that. Now that power, of course, is I think it's averaging a little over 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So it's obviously cheaper than Block Island.
But if we were to look at a chart like this for the one off of Long Island, would we essentially see the same thing?
Yeah, the only one I show in there, I think, is a monthly, because the very last chart in the report shows you where it is, and I plotted against the 47%, which is essentially the Block Island initial, threshold theoretical capacity. And you will see that in the winter months, it's been better than that, but in the summer months, it's been below that. But I don't know what the number is. If it's 42%, it'll be something different.
Now let me go back to Rhode Island. So Rhode Island's windmills are underperforming expectations. They're trying to shift the goalpost to make it think that somehow it's performing up to expectations. But here's my question. Is it under expectations because the wind doesn't blow as much as they thought in Rhode Island, or because there's some kind of inefficiency or poor design or mechanical problems that are causing these structures to not produce the electricity that was promised? Is it the weather, or is it something mechanical?
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't.
Okay.
And you can ask Orsted, and you won't get an answer because
I guess what I'm trying to ultimately understand, is there any reason to expect that a newer wind farm and another wind farm, maybe by a different company, maybe using different technology, would produce any better results, or is this just the way it's going to be for Rhode Island?
the newer wind farms are claiming that they're going to have higher output, but we don't know. We haven't seen. The first one that would be questionable is South Fork, because we don't have anything up and running in the New England area. That's where the Virginia one, which I referenced, which is doing better than the standard, is interesting. At the time, the regulators were approving that project, and there were people who were fighting it that worked out a requirement of performance. The wind farm is supposed to produce 42% of its total capacity, and that's the threshold. The regulators put that in as a standard, and if the wind farm failed to produce that, the company, Virginia Wind, which is part of Dominion Wind, was required to produce the power and pay for it. The company had to pay for it, not the ratepayers.
Yep.
But that was considered a deal killer by Dominion Wind, Dominion Energy's
Right.
management.
It would be.
And they negotiated with the interveners a deal that it's 42% with a rolling 3-year average. And they have to explain why they didn't get the 42%. And then they are liable for making up the cost of that power. But they're comfortable. And at the moment, the 2 test turbines are producing well over 50%. So
All right,
they're comfortable, but they refused to accept a performance standard that up in Rhode Island.
So no cost benefit analysis, no performance standard set. I mean, this whole thing is based on wishful thinking, right?
This is part of the whole offshore wind narrative.
Scam. It's a scam.
You used the word, I didn't.
I know.
I won't argue with that description.
All right, last question. So we asked you about Rhode Island. We asked you about Northeast regionally. I don't know if you have just a general observation across the world where there are other wind farms, Europe or other parts of the U.S. Are you seeing these same underperformance issues?
You see it in a number of places. It's really hard to get the data and the analysis.
On purpose, right?
Yes. Remember, virtually in the U.S., every one of these projects is built by an LLC, a limited liability corporation.
Yeah, was trying to make billions. Yeah,
because they are not subject to public disclosure of their numbers.
Right.
The North Sea in the UK.
Convenient. How convenient.
They do have wind farms that have to file audited financial statements. And I have looked at those, and others, Gordon Hughes from Scotland has looked at them. And in the UK, unless you have a subsidy, none of them make money with their performance. They make money by having a subsidy, the government paying a subsidy.
Yep.
Welcome to the subsidy game.
So not only are they underperforming, not only are they reliant on public subsidies in addition. So we're paying not only public money through our taxes to fund these things, but then we're paying for the high cost of the rates of the electricity they produce. But but we're also not even getting what we were told we would be getting, and it's all. I mean, this the windmills are just part of the whole Rhode Island, our act on climate, our goal, our race, if you would, our stupid race to net zero. I mean, I think this is true across all alternative energy or renewable energy. Another name for it, alternatives. They just can't meet. They're just not ready for prime time. And there's no, with the decreased performance, Alan, they're not giving taxpayers a break on it or ratepayers a break. The decreased performance is probably, they're still paying the same high amount for it. So that cost benefit analysis is just going off the chart negative right now.
Exactly. And, you see it if you open your electric bill and look at the description of the breakdown of the charges on your bill, you will find a lot for green energy programs, clean energy programs, etc. If you do the math, the average cost of your power and the average cost of the fuel component, the fuel is about 50% of the average cost. I've been tracking this since I put on solar panels on my summer home here. I track it month by month, and that's what it works out to. I just re-upped my power in my home in Texas, and my power cost is about 10% lower than Rhode Island's. And actually, it will be on an annual basis about 4 cents a kilowatt hour less than I pay up here. But more importantly, the other component, the other 14 or 15 cents per kilowatt hour that I'm paying up here, I'm only going to pay 4 to 5 cents in Texas.
Right.
Because
So
we don't have the same green power standards.
So again, as my first guest said, and we'll close with this, a final word from you. This is an AI generated image, but it's true. Eye-popping, cross-eyed, can't believe where my energy bill is going. It's not Rhode Island Energy's fault. They have to comply with the mandates put forth by our state government, our lawmakers, our bureaucrats at DEM, Department of Environmental Management. This is all legislative agenda, politics driven. It's not greedy corporate Rhode Island Energy. Final word to you, Alan Brooks, on that.
Oh, that's exactly the situation. Most people do not understand their electric bills. They do not understand, what all the components are and what drives those costs. And if they were to track them as I have done, you would see, dramatic increases. Again, to Rhode Island Energy's, benefit, and I take my hat off to them. Actually, the last offshore wind project that applied for a contract for power was rejected because the cost was going to be well in excess of any of the benefits. For $3 billion of extra cost that the ratepayers were going to have to pay. Not only did Rhode Island Energy conclude that, but so did the PUC staff and the Energy Department staff of Rhode Island.
Right.
So what happened when we were due to have a hearing where we would learn something about that bill? Orsted said, "Oh, our contract, actually, our bid expired the day before the hearing." So they had to call off the hearing. So
how
those of us
convenient
who were
again.
interested in knowledge got nothing out of it.
All right, so folks, bottom line, when your electric bill makes your eyes pop out of your head, don't blame Rhode Island Energy. Don't blame the Public Utilities Commission. Blame the governor and our past governor, and blame your elected representative and senator from your district who voted for the Act on Climate, who voted for Rhode Island's net zero policy. This is all politics driven, and that's been our theme forever and ever. Alan Brooks, thank you for all the great research you do on this. We'll have you back on regularly. You're a regular guest on Energy now. But thank you for your time today and for being here and In the Dugout.
Okay. Enjoyed it, Mike. Thanks.
I talk to you soon. And folks, we thank you for tuning in. A lot more coming up. Look, as I mentioned in my open, we're going to be following these Senate Commission hearings that'll be meeting over the next 8 or 9 months. So this isn't the last you're going to be hearing of me on this topic, or Alan on this topic, or even Martin, my first guest on this topic. But either way, for now, Mike Stenhouse out. We'll see you next game.